Okay, in this last lesson, I'm going to be discussing creating VrayPhysicalCamera and also exposure control in your render if you don't have a 3ds Max or a VrayPhysicalCamera in your scene, or maybe you have a camera in your scene, but in order to analyze your scene, you try rendering from multiple perspective views and you want to have some sort of exposure control in your scene. So if you open up the environment and effects window from the rendering menu or just press 8, we have a section called exposure control. Right now it's set to physical camera exposure control, and in the physical camera exposure rollout, use physical camera control if available is enabled. Therefore, if we are viewing the scene through a physical camera, the exposure controls from that camera will be used. Right now we have no camera in the scene, so we can control the exposure of our render through the global exposure parameters down here. We have the exposure value. If I render the scene right now, you can see from the light cache preview it's a bit overexposed. So stop the render, and this time let's set the exposure value to something like 10 and render again. Now you can see from the light cache preview that we have a well exposed scene. Also, we can control the white balance like we did in the physical camera. So if I use temperature and set the temperature to something like 3500 and render the scene, as you can see, we get a very cool render. Let's for now set the temperature to 6500 and enable illuminant again. We also have some other controls down here. Instead of physical camera exposure controls, we can use V-Ray exposure controls, and now we have a very simple and familiar set of parameters to control the exposure of our scenes like we would have done if we were using a VrayPhysicalCamera. First we have mode, and right now it's set to photographic, so shutter speed, f-number and ISO will affect the overall exposure. If I set the mode from EV parameter, the exposure will be controlled by this single exposure value here. If I render the scene right now, you can see it's fairly well exposed. If I set it to -5 and render the scene, you can see we have an overexposed render. And if I set it to +3 and render again, the scene becomes underexposed. You can see the way exposure value works here is a bit different compared to the one in the physical camera, but they are doing the same thing. And we have from VrayCamera, and in that mode you specify a VrayPhysicalCamera in the camera node here, and the exposure settings will be taken from that camera. You can render your scene in any perspective view that you want, but the exposure settings will be taken from the specified camera node here. And down here you also have some white balance controls. You can use some presets like neutral and daylight, or you can set it to temperature and use any temperature to control the white balance, or use any custom color. And one final thing, if you are craving a VrayPhysicalCamera and you want to use it instead of a 3ds Max physical camera, what you need to do is to open up the Max script listener and run this simple command: vray create VrayPhysicalCamera, and let me just copy paste it here and press enter. Now we have a new VrayPhysicalCamera in the scene, as you can see in the Explorer here. Let's select the camera, press Ctrl C so the camera adheres to the current perspective view, and then press C to see the scene through this new VrayPhysicalCamera. And if you go to the modify panel, you can see we have all of these camera settings. Maybe the layout is a bit different, but we discussed these parameters in the 3ds Max physical camera, and they are doing pretty much the same here. And I suggest that you use 3ds Max physical camera in your scenes instead of VrayPhysicalCamera. Okay, perfect. So in this lesson we learned about exposure controls and how to create a VrayPhysicalCamera. I will see you in the next section.